Well, welcome this morning. It's a smaller gathering. I know there's a number who are tuning in online, and I know many people have sought an opportunity to evacuate Melbourne. We've been locked in for so long. We had the ring of steel, didn't we, for months on end. And so there is a great freedom and opportunity to go away. But thank you for coming and joining us in person. Thank you to those who are connected in online. It is great to see you and great to be together. And I trust that you had a wonderful Christmas. I trust that you had the opportunity to be still for a moment, to reflect, to remember, to celebrate the wonder and the beauty of Jesus. And it's funny, isn't it? Christmas we often think of as this time of incredible love and joy and especially peace. I think peace because we stop, don't we? It's like we hit stop or at least pause for this one day, for Christmas Day. Everything goes on hold. We turn off from work or study or whatever we've been doing. We call a truce in those ongoing battles and arguments and feuds we have in our family and with our relatives. We come to church on Friday, which we never usually do. Once a week is usually enough, hey? We come on Friday and celebrate. And this year, we put all our conversations, all the struggles and all the things we have been through this year, throughout the bushfires and the Black Lives Matter, throughout coronavirus, we put all those conversations on the shelf and just enjoy being for a moment. One day it's like everything stops. Maybe that's Christmas Day for you. I know for some people that's a busy day. You're going from one family to the next. And so Boxing Day is the day you stop. In our house yesterday was post-Christmas recovery. Just trying to slow down, catch up with ourselves, build a few things that came for Christmas. But for most of us, once we get past this season, whether it's today or tomorrow, we hit play again. Everything stopped, and then all of a sudden we hit play, or even fast forward, and everything goes back to normal. Or so we're told, our new COVID normal. And life takes over again. Well, this year, I wanted to take some space. As John said, we have one Sunday between Christmas and New Year's. And so I really wanted to take some space and create some space for us before life gets out of control, before activities, just everything becomes a blur again. Wanted to take some space in this week, and this Sunday particularly, to pause. And to allow God to speak to us. Allow us to pause and reflect and to listen and to learn from God. For God to reiterate and maybe even consolidate some of the lessons that He has been trying to teach us throughout this year. Amid the challenges that we have faced and the struggles within ourselves. The question of what is God saying? What are the lessons He wants me to learn? And how does this shape the new COVID normal in my life, for us as a church, in our community, as we seek to follow and serve Jesus in this space? As John said, Christmas is very much all year round, isn't it? As Christians, we celebrate it on one day, but we know that the story of Jesus continues on. The story of Jesus is as relevant today as it was yesterday, as it was 30 years ago. The story of Jesus continues on. And today, as we move through this process of reflection and response, I want to base what we look at from the story of Mary and Joseph. Because the story of Jesus continues, even in the scriptures. Often we skip over this and we move to our next series and the next thing that we're doing in church life. But I wanted to pause and to recapture the story that unfolds for Mary and Joseph, their new post-Christmas normal. And to help us wrestle through this, we're going to focus in on the story of Joseph and Mary as they leave Bethlehem, and then as God gathers them back in to life among His people. Now, if you remember the story, the wise men have come. Sorry, I've got my boundaries here just to keep me in check. But the story is the wise men have come. They have seen Herod on the way through. They've come and spent their time worshipping Jesus. And then they head off another way, being warned by an angel. And these wise guys, as Herod probably thinks of them, they avoided reporting back to him about this new king they were going to worship. And so he takes matters into his own hands, as we often see. He chooses to do something horrible, something unspeakable. See, King Herod is otherwise known as this great king. He was a master architect and builder. He built. He would have been appointed in the Roman Empire of Israel and Judah. And history tells us that he built a number of theatres and palaces and cities and fortresses. He built his own kingdom. Herod was interested in building his own kingdom more than understanding what God was doing in that space in his time. Herod was a master builder, but he was also a very insecure leader. As much as he called himself Herod the Great, and that was the name that we know him as, Herod the Great. And so he led firmly. As an insecure man, he led firmly and often ruthlessly. He murdered his own wife, several of his own sons, out of fear that they would rise up and they would take his throne. They would take over his kingdom, the kingdom that he had made for himself. And so, as you can imagine, when he hears about this new king, Herod decides that he will take matters into his own hands. There's a new king being prepared to take over his throne. He will take matters into his own hands. And it says, when he realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, the wise men, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all of the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, those who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. It's a horrific situation, isn't it? A tragic story. And yet it fulfilled the words of the prophet Jeremiah. It says, a voice is heard in Ramah, weeping, a great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. It's a horrific story, isn't it? Horrific story. And as I read this, it struck me how often we fall into the same trap as Herod. We become so preoccupied, don't we, with building our own homes, our careers, our kingdoms, that we tend to ignore God sometimes. We forget about God and we just go about our own business. We take control of our lives and start doing whatever we want, whenever we want, regardless of how it impacts the people around us. And sometimes lose sight of who God is, what He is seeking to do in and through our lives. And I think this pattern is becoming increasingly clear in my life, in our lives, and in our society. And I think it became increasingly clear throughout this COVID period, didn't it? Our lives were thrown into chaos, our world spinning out of control, and we saw the rise of all these strong, egotistical leaders who were pushing for power, fighting to build their kingdoms. Political tensions starting to rise, instability increasing, and amid all these people suffering and dying. And yet more often than a global problem, we find it within ourselves. We felt in our own lives, in our own hearts, that our plans have been thrown into chaos. Our lives into disarray. Our hearts became distressed, and we got so caught up in what we were meant to be doing. We struggled to stop, to let go and to listen to God. We struggled sometimes to remember that God is God, that He is good. And somewhere amid the mess that we experience, He is working out all things for His good, for His glory. And the interesting thing is that even though Herod had no interest in God, God continues to work out His plan and His purpose in and around Herod, and through the lives of people like Joseph and the wise men who were willing to listen and to learn and to follow where God led. So we often think Joseph was driven out of Bethlehem, don't we? Joseph was driven out in fear of death, that Herod would come and would kill him, would kill Jesus. And yet what we see in this story is it wasn't for fear that Joseph left Bethlehem. It was because God called him. It's God who called him to move away from God's people. God who sends him out into the world. That's what it says. The wise men have gone. The angel comes and speaks to Joseph in the dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you Herod is going to search for the child and kill him. Do you notice what happens? Do you see what this means? That God already knew. God already knew what Herod was going to do. God already knew what was going to happen in this moment in history. And so by his grace, he calls Joseph. He sends him out into the world. In verse 14, so he got up. Joseph responds. Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod, fulfilling what the Lord had said, the prophet out of Egypt. Through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Can you imagine this? Jesus is almost 2 years old, we learn, when the Magi come and visit. He's almost 2 years old. Joseph and Mary have settled to life in Bethlehem. They've gotten to know their neighbours. They've established their friendship networks. Jesus goes out and plays in the courtyard with the kids in the street. They've got their family around them. This is Joseph's hometown. And yet all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, God comes. And Joseph's probably working as a carpenter by now. He's picked up his trade and he's doing it where he is, and yet God comes in the middle of the night and uproots everything. Calls Joseph and Mary to leave their family, to step out of their community among the people of God. And it's not just to fulfill a prophecy. I think often we read and it's like, okay, they had to do this because there was a prophecy to be fulfilled. Not just to fulfill a prophecy, but so God's plan and his purpose can continue to be worked out in and through the lives of Mary and Joseph and through the life of Jesus, his son. And as I thought about this year and all we have been through, can't help but wonder if the same is true for us. Rather than coronavirus separating us and forcing us out, in a spiritual sense, if this is not God, if this was not God sending us, calling us out, sending us into our community so he can get our attention again, so he can restore our passion for him, so he can re-stir this priority and passion for mission. And as much as we have been in our community and isolated and separated, we have still met on Sundays. The question, I guess, in my mind is we learnt the lessons. God had a purpose in sending us out. We're willing to listen like Joseph. Willing to learn what God is doing. And willing to obey and follow where he leads. So this morning I want to invite us to take a moment. So I want to talk less, I'll talk a little bit more. I want to take a moment to reflect on this past year. To reflect on what has been going on this year where God, by his grace and his wisdom, has called us out of the church, has scattered us in and throughout our community. To reflect and ask the question of what is God saying? What is God doing? And how can we be like Joseph and Mary? How can we be people who hear, and who listen, and who respond and obey? I want to invite us to take a moment. John has put together a video for us. It'll come up on the screen, and just want to be mindful. So it's a video that has a number of images and headlines from throughout this year. I think often we move on so quickly and we forget what we have been through. We forget the experiences, the emotions, the connections. And so John has put this video together, and if you've got kids, you might want to distract them for a moment. It's nothing graphic, but it's just, I guess it's confronting. And I have to admit, and I think that those of us who have seen it, it moved us to tears to think about what our world has been like. And yet in the midst of that, to ask the question of what is God saying and what is God doing? So it's incredibly beautiful, but it is also very powerful. And so if you want to distract your kids, you're very welcome to, but there is, it's just images of headlines and things that have happened throughout this year. And as you watch, I want you to consider maybe what God, the feelings and the emotions, the things you have experienced, but what God is saying. So often we stop with our feelings, but what is God saying to you in the midst of that? What is God wanting you to learn? How is He trying to grow you? And we're going to take a moment to watch this video. I might pray for us, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to share some of those lessons that we feel God has put on our hearts. A lesson whether it's for you or whether you think it may be for us as a church, but just a time where you can share one of those lessons, something that God has been teaching you. So let's take a moment, watch the screen, and just invite God to speak.
The largest fire front in the country's history.
Blood-red skies across a holiday haven, surrounded by a fiery hell.
That behind me is Malakuta.
This is midday in the middle of Bateman's Bay.
Overwhelming.
Residents and businesses are opening their arms.
Days, the 22-year-old has been rescuing some of the smallest five.
Their cities are in chaos. Millions of Americans have taken to the streets in what have become deadly protests against police violence.
Rioting provoked by race. The death of a black man at the hands of a white policeman.
I can't breathe! George Floyd! George Floyd!
From coast to coast, America taking aim and turning on its...
International rescue teams are flying into Beirut tonight to help pull survivors from the mountains of rubble. The death...
0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA. Go SpaceX.
This is what rain looks like for the very first time.
So satisfying for drought-ravaged regions.
Who is Lord but our Lord? Who is God, only God? You are the highest. You are most good. Matchless is your love. Our praise will rise above. Your peace like a river floods over us. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. This is where my hope lies. This is where my soul sighs, and I will always find my rest in you. So full of mercy, beauty and mystery. You are most hidden, but always with us. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. This is where my hope lies. This is where my soul sighs, and I will always find my rest in you. Oh, this is where my hope lies.
Thank you for that, John and team. And so I want to pick this up again. So like Mary and Joseph, my conviction is that we have been called out, not by a virus, but called out by God. Called out of the church, called out of our comfort zone, called out of our complacency that so often we settle into. And I'm convinced that God has been using this season to send us into our communities, to grow us and stretch us and challenge us. And my hope and my prayer is this has changed me. Kids. Any of the kids here? We have a folder for you guys here. If you want to come and grab that, you're very welcome to as I talk. If you've got kids at home, I'm sure you've got some colouring somewhere that they can enjoy and allow you to continue with us. But as I said, my conviction, my belief is that we have been scattered. We have been sent by God into our communities and across our city because He wants to grow us. He wants to restore our passion and our priority for Jesus. And as I say, my prayer is that, my hope is that God has changed, that God is still changing us. He is still teaching us. He is still stretching and growing our faith. And that is our series over this summer, will be Faith is Rising. We just want to embrace the lessons that God has been teaching. We want to apply them to our lives and into how we think about and how we do church together. Because rather than keep doing what we have always done, which isn't really working, if you look at the stats, the church in the West, the church in Australia is shrinking. The church globally is booming, but the church in the West, the church as we know it, as we have seen it, the church as we have experienced, is in decline, and it has been for decades. And so as we return from COVID, from this scattering and sending, the challenge is not to return according to our own plans, not to return to the same thing we have always been doing, but to look at what it truly means to follow Jesus. What it means to gather as His people, what it means to serve Him in our community and the world, to reimagine church as it needs to be for our generation. And as much as we know this deep in ourselves, the danger I think sometimes as we move on, we've heard God speak, we've wrestled with some of the lessons, but we move on without putting what God has taught us into practice. The danger is we so quickly fall back into these same patterns and traditions, doing things the way we have always done. We sit in the same seat on a Sunday morning and sing the same songs again and again without carrying forth the new passion and heart for Jesus in the midst of it. Instead of listening to God and allowing Him to lead us back in, to shape who we are as individuals, who we become as the community of faith. And so as we take these lessons and seek to apply them in our lives and through the church, rather than trust ourselves, we need to allow God to set the direction. We need to follow His leading. And we need to allow Him to be the one who shapes our lives and His church. I think that's the challenge I face often. When I go in the car, I often have this challenge, the wrestle between the GPS and myself. And I have this lady in the car who tells me where I need to go and how to get there. And yet so often I find myself thinking I know better. So I choose my own adventure. Okay, if I just go here, I know where I'm going. I know how to get there. End up going my own direction. But Siri, in her grace and goodness, always makes the necessary alterations to get me back in the right direction, to lead me to where I need to be, where I need to go. And in many senses, I think that's what God does with Mary and Joseph in this story. Although their GPS is not about a physical location, as we often read in terms of Bethlehem and Egypt and Nazareth, it's about God positioning them. God positioning them. And that's what he wants to do for me and for you and for us as a church. To help us reorient ourselves, to reimagine what it means to be the church, to rediscover what it means to follow Jesus. Not just do church. Not just show up on a Sunday and go through the motions. So as we pick up this story again, Joseph and Mary, they've been living in Egypt about 3 years. So Jesus is sort of 5 years old. You know, this is a terrible time to uproot your life and to move. And yet Herod the Great dies, and that's when God calls them back. The GPS kicks into play again. The angel of God comes and speaks to Mary and to Joseph and to Mary. God's positioning system starts to guide them. He directs Joseph and Mary back to Israel. After Herod died, it says, an angel of the Lord appeared to them in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took his child and the mother and went to the land of Israel. One of the things that stood out to me is the beauty and the simplicity. The angel comes, God speaks, Joseph uproots everything and obeys. No questions. I'm sure he had questions. We don't see them. But he trusts God. He follows God. And in some senses, it makes sense in terms of Joseph's character, doesn't it? Because we know at the beginning when he heard about this new baby and he's ready to divorce Mary, we hear he's a man of upright character. A man who listened and longed to follow God's direction. And so when God speaks, as much as he had questions, he goes. He goes. He responds with obedience. This is what it means to follow Jesus, and I think it's a challenge for myself. It is a challenge for us in this season of returning and regathering as a church, reimagining what it means to be the people of God, is to become less fixated on our own plans and our own opinions, less focused on the destination and more faithful to the journey that God is leading us on. We often have the destination, and yet what matters is the journey that God is leading us on. See, God doesn't tell Joseph where to go. He doesn't tell him to return to Bethlehem. He doesn't tell him where to go. Although Joseph probably in his mind is thinking home, Bethlehem, re-establish things again. Israel, if you remember, is this massive nation. And so God gives him all of Israel as a starting point. And with all of Israel, Joseph sets off, maybe with a picture in his head. But as he starts to get there, as he moves across the border and into Israel, he said it heard Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, and he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. God unsettles Joseph's spirit. As he begins to make his way into Israel, God unsettles his plans to return to Bethlehem. And he speaks to them in a dream. He points him away from Bethlehem, away from returning to the comforts of home, away from doing the things that he had established before he was called out. And to his credit, Joseph listens. Joseph follows. Joseph goes. I don't know if you've ever experienced that sense of uneasiness, unsettledness within yourself. For me, I have to admit, whenever I drive into Melbourne, I have that feeling of uneasiness. I love Melbourne. Melbourne is home. But there's something, isn't it? You leave Melbourne because it's holidays. And so you leave, and I have this invisible line around the city of Melbourne that when I cross on the way out of Melbourne, it's like, relax. I'm out, it's holidays, I can unwind, forget about everything. And then driving back in, I have this point where you start to see the lights of the city and the weight returns. That burden, that expectation, that pressure. There's this uneasiness of spirit sometimes. And sometimes God will use that uneasiness, that unsettledness to get our attention. And he uses it for Joseph to give him new directions, further directions. And the same can be true for us today when God unsettles our spirit. More often than not, it's to guide us and direct us, to change our direction, to lead us in His ways. And so as we start to return and reimagine the church, as we start to re-establish the rhythms of life, it's important to recognise we don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers, but we trust a God who does. We follow a God who does. And He doesn't always reveal them in our time, according to our plans. Doesn't always lead us in the direction that we hoped He might. But when we follow by faith and pursue Him in obedience, He will lead us somewhere greater. When we choose to seek Him in moments of challenge and indecision, as we've experienced this year, even when we think we know the direction, when we allow God to readjust our thinking, it changes everything. That's what Joseph does, and it leads him to Nazareth. And as much as we have all these ideas about road trips, this exciting thing where you jump in the car and you go wherever the wind takes you, as people, we like to get in, plug in our GPS coordinates, and let the car lead us. And the challenge is to apply that same thinking in relation to God. So we step back into the church. We don't have the plan, we don't have the destination, but we trust that God will lead us every step of the way. I can't help but wonder if God will take us in a different direction to where any of us maybe have even ever imagined. If church will look different than somehow it was before, similarities but differences, if our lives need to look different than they did before COVID began. So with Joseph and Mary, with their baby, in verse 23 it says, having warned them in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee and went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So it was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. God leads Joseph in a new direction. And Joseph responds in faith. And I think that is our challenge as the people of God today and in the days to come. To trust God. Follow God. Listen for the lessons He has taught us and apply them so that we might see the church can begin to flourish in our community, in our culture, in our country. Whatever the lessons God has laid on your heart this season, whatever the lessons that He has put on your heart from today, hearing those that He has put on others, I think the challenge is a willingness like Mary and Joseph to take these lessons, to apply them to our lives. And for this to happen, it means releasing some things. We all have things that we hold so tightly on, control of our lives. The freedom to choose our career path. To sleep in on a Sunday morning and forget about church. We all will make our choices, and the challenge is to make those choices which allow us to continue to follow Jesus. To listen to Him. To learn from Him. To grow with Him. So that together, or individually, our lives begin to reflect more and more of His heart. So together as a church, our mission becomes His mission for us in this community. Whatever those lessons that God has put on your heart, I really encourage you not to let them go in the midst of the busyness that is emerging, but to continue, as we have heard, to take the opportunity to be still, to immerse ourselves in God's Word, to keep listening and learning and growing in our relationship with Jesus. And then have the courage to live that out. To live that out in your own life, with your own mission in the places where God has called you. To live that out together as a church community with all the people that God brings into our building, but who is a part of our wider community as we seek to serve them. John and the worship team are going to come and continue to lead us as we reflect and to lead us in worship. So as they come, I really encourage you to hold that lesson, to hold those things that God has been saying. Let go of control, listen, allow God to lead, and have the courage of Joseph to step out in faith.